In SQL Server, there are two types of data file. One is called a primary data file with file extension .mdf, and another file type is .ldf, means transaction log file. Most of the time we deal with MDF and LDF, and the data is all saved into MDF file. And LDF file is the log file. That means we can check to see what happened, the transaction or logins or any updates, we can find it out from the log file. But all data files, like database tables, store procedures, are saved into MDF. It's called the primary data file. And here's the file structure in SQL Server database. This is the first type of primary data file, the log file. Meanwhile, you also see optional file groups with NDF or other file groups. If our file database become bigger and a lot of transactions, we probably need to create other type of data files. But most of the time, use MDF and LDF. Database types. Relational database is what we used most of the time. A relational database means there's tables with the relationship. SQL Server takes the database as a record written in metadata containing name of the database, properties of database, name and location of all files or folders representing storage for database. The first database type is called a master database. It is the basis of correctly running the SQL Server service. Logins all other databases and their files instance configurations, linked server definitions, and lists of error messages are all examples of the data stored in master database. And notice here we have a parameter D and L followed by the path of the master MDF, LDF files. These parameters are very important in the situation where the admin wants to move the master's file to different location. Changing their value is possible in SQL Server Configuration Manager by selecting the startup parameters in tab in Property dialog box. And one of the database is called MSDF database server. MSDF database is service as the storage of SQL Server agent objects, database mail definition, and service broker configuration integration service objects. This data is used mostly for SQL Server automation, such as the SQL Server agent jobs, or for diagnostics, such as SSIS logs and database mail logs. The MSDF database also stores logs about backups and restored events of each database. Database model can be used as a template for every new database while it's being created. During database creation, files are created on defined paths, and all objects, data, properties of the database model are created, copied, and sent in the new database during its creation. TempDB database. It plays a very special role in every SQL Server instance. It's used by SQL Server as well as developers to save temporary data such as temporary tables, table variables, static cursors. Its database is intended for short lifespan of all the objects stored in it. SQL Server clears its database by truncating all the data from it or dropping or recreating this database every time it is started. As TempDB will never contain durable data, it has special internal behavior. This is the reason why accessing data is in the database is several times faster than accessing durable data in other database. The resource database is the fifth in our is the fifth in our enumeration and contains the definition of all the system objects, like system objects. It's not configurable, and we do not use regular backup strategies for it. It always placed in the installation path of SQL Server. Now let's see how it looks like in our database from the Management Studio. This is the Management Studio. Whenever I open the Management Studio, I can see my server. And also you notice here there's a folder called Databases. So if I click on the plus, I expand it here. You see I have a system database. And under that you can see master database, model database, MSDB database, TempDB. So if you these are from the system, like master database, it has tables, and in the table you can see it has system table, external table, and graph tables. The system table has these tables here. External table is empty, and we have a graphic table is empty. And these are the views, cinemas, and procedures, views saved into this serves in this database and manage the tables. This is the master database. And we also notice here we have a model database. Meanwhile, it has tables in it. System table, external table. This is the MSDB has tables. And this is a temp table. So this is all from the, whenever you install SQL Server, automatically you have this database created for you, and they're used for different purposes. Like what we mentioned here, we have a MSDB, database model, TempDB, resource DB. They use it for different purposes. File group is an organizational metadata object that contains one or more data file. File groups do not have its own representation in the file system. It's just a group of files. The primary file groups contains primary data file, and we divided the file groups as those. Row storage file group contains data file like MDF or NDF. File stream file groups, it doesn't contain data file, but folders or to store binary data such as a scanned document or pictures are put into the file stream file group. In-memory file group is the only one instance of this kind of the file group can be created in database. Internally, it is a special case of a file stream file group and is used by SQL Server to persist data from in-memory table. Every file group has 4 simple properties: name, default value. In a set of file group of the same type, one of the file group has this option to set to on. That means when the new table or index is created but not assigned a specific file group to store data in, the default file group is used. Read-only, every file group except the primary file group and the in-memory file group can be set to read-only, means you cannot change it. When the data is moved from the current period to the table created in this historical file group, the file group could be set to read-only. Marking the file group as read-only prevents user from making any change to the data placed in the read-only file group. That makes sense because when we save data, we don't delete the data without careful checking on it. So that's why it's set to read-only as a default. Auto-group files. This type of row storage file group is new in SQL Server 2019. When more files are added to a certain file group, SQL Server distributes data across all files using proportion fill algorithm called PFA. That means more data is added to bigger file within a set of files in the same file group. This behavior can lead to uneven distribution of data. Turning on auto-grow fill property ensures SQL Server keeps the size of all the files within the file group the same when auto-grow event occurs. If I open Management Studio and I look at a property, like any property of these tables, I can see there's a file groups. You see the name, file, read only, default, allow auto-grow. If you need it, you can check it or uncheck it from here. And same as file stream, read only, default. You can also add a file group by clicking on this dialog box there, and you can give a name and continue from here. Every database must have at least one data file called a primary data file, and this file is always bound to the primary file group. This file stores all the metadata of the database, such as the structural description, users, and so on. If the database does not have other data files, all users' data is stored in this file, but this approach is good enough for smaller database. And there's also a secondary data file. They're optional, but you can use if you have a lot of data, you have a large set of data. Both types of data files have the same internal structure, and every file is divided into 5 kilobytes. SQL Server maintains several types of database pages, such as data pages, index allocation maps, global allocation maps, shared global allocation maps. A data page never contains the data of several objects. Data pages do not know each other. Data pages do not have any special physical ordering. A data row must always fit in data page. Transaction log. When SQL Server processes any transaction, it works in a way called two-phase commit. When the client starts a transaction by sending a single data manipulation language request or by calling begin or trend command, SQL Server requests data page from the disk memory through buffer cache and makes the requested change in these data page memories. When DML request is executed or committed, command comes from the client, the first phase of commit is completed. But the data pages in memory differ from their original version of data file on disk. The data page in memory is in a static called 30. When transaction runs, transaction log file used by SQL Server for every detailed description of every single action that was done during the transaction. The second phase process, the checkpoint, includes search for dirty page in the buffer cache, save dirty pages to the original data file location, make these data pages as clean in the buffer cache, make the transaction at a checkpoint or inactive in the transaction log. Now let's look at the data files in the Management Studio. So I open it up right here. And notice here there's a file option here, file page here, and in it you can see we have a database name called master, and the owner, you can change owner of you. By default it's called SA, but this is created by Microsoft SQL Server Development Group, so they just put SA as the owner, but you can change it if you wanted to. You can go right here. If you have any user created here, you can change the user, you can change the owner. And notice here inside we have a master and a master log, and the type is rows and log. One file group master belongs to primary file group, and master log doesn't belong to anybody. The size 5 megabytes, 2 megabytes. Auto grow by 10%. That means if you have add more data in it, it grows by 10% each time if the size is meet the limit. And here's a location where you can find the data files.